I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast, where we cover news stories the mainstream media would rather you not know about. We try to recover some lost history and explain the inexplicable. We appreciate you taking time to join us. So please, whether you're watching this on the video version or listening to the audio version of this podcast, subscribe, leave us a rating. Email us at info@judicialwatch.org. Tell us what you want us to cover, who you want us to interview. We appreciate you taking time joining us week after week. And we've had great growth in the podcast and some great evaluations and ratings. We appreciate that too. Today we're joined by Shawn Fleetwood, who is a staff writer for the Federalist. Welcome, Shawn, to On Watch.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Shawn, you've been doing some reporting recently about the return of censorship. Just when we thought that the federal government had had its wrist slapped and been told, stop it, knock it off, it seems they haven't gotten the message. Tell us about your recent reporting. What's it going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, so early last week, Senator Mark Warner, who's the Democrat who heads the Senate Intel Committee, was speaking with reporters, and he basically told them, like, hey, the FBI, CISA, and some of these federal agencies have resumed communications with big tech companies to censor what they call disinformation.
And you said CISA. What is, for people, I know people have a general idea that the federal government is talking to tech companies and telling them what to do and not do. But what is CISA? What's their role?
So CISA is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, which really could use a new name. But it falls under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It was created during the Trump administration, and basically the idea was that it would crack down on like foreign interference in elections, right? So like Russia trying to interfere in the 2016 election, that was like the whole basis of setting up this agency. And so kind of taking a step backwards, we have this Supreme Court case right now called Murthy v. Missouri, where back in 2022, the states of Missouri and Louisiana filed a lawsuit against the federal government alleging that they had pressured social media companies, big tech companies, to squash what the information they deemed to be unfavorable.
Which is, let's pause for a second and think about that or discuss that. Isn't it interesting that Missouri and Louisiana are suing the federal government and saying, hey, what are you guys doing? Why are you trying to control information and censor and suppress people getting free information that is, I mean, you can read whatever you want. You can either accept it or not, or you can make your own value judgment. So even that all by itself is pretty remarkable, that attorneys general from states are pressuring the federal government, right?
Yeah.
And how did that case eventually turn out?
Right, so through discovery, they unearthed a lot of communications between the White House and agencies like the CDC, CISA, for example, kind of contacting big tech companies like Facebook, then Twitter, now X, asking if they can like remove certain posts and so-called disinformation. A district court judge ruled in July of 2023, put an injunction in place saying, no, you can't do this anymore. That was later upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in September. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court, while agreeing to take up the case, they lifted that injunction in October of last year. And so basically that gave the green light to agencies like the FBI, like CISA, to resume that communication, squashing disinformation, or what they call disinformation, with these federal agencies and big tech companies. And so the Federalists reached out to the FBI, to CISA, to ask, are the Senator Mark Warner's comments true? Have you resumed communications with these big tech companies to suppress so-called disinformation? And the FBI, through a very milquetoast statement, basically admitted that yes, they have resumed that. CISA completely declined to even issue a comment on the matter, and they said that their director will be participating in some sort of hearing in the coming weeks on so-called election security. So we'll see where that goes, but pretty much that's what we have now, is resumed squashing of disinformation.
And there are innumerable instances where things that have been termed disinformation have actually turned out to be factually correct and true.
Yeah.
Right? So things like, small things like the Hunter Biden laptop,
yes.
right? Now we have Ashley Biden recently affirming to a court that her diary where she says that she was showering with her father as like a 12 or 13-year-old girl, which is to me the definition of some kind of child sexual abuse or pedophilia or whatever I call it, that's true also. But there's been other instances as well, medical questions and issues about COVID. I like to remind people that the Russians have been tampering with elections since the Bolsheviks came in 1917. So we've had 100 years of Russians trying to influence elections. That's no surprise or change. Are there other instances? Are there other issues that come to mind that where they've clearly tried to put their hands on the scales and shift things, and it turned out not to be so?
Right. Well, you bring up the Hunter Biden laptop story, and it's important to keep in mind, like you had polling conducted after the election where a substantial amount of voters said, had I known about this story, it would have changed the way that I voted.
Right.
So it's significantly impacting the electoral process. And what's even more significant about that story is you had the FBI, according to IRS whistleblowers, had verified Hunter Biden's laptop as early as late 2019. And what the FBI ended up doing in the months after that is going to big tech companies like Facebook, like Twitter, and saying, you guys should be on the lookout for so-called hack and leak operations, foreign disinformation from countries like Russia, and you should probably censor that. Basically a nod to wink indicating to them that, hey, this story is coming down the pipeline, we're going to need you to censor that.
Right.
And ultimately that's what you had end up happening. Facebook suppressed the story. Mark Zuckerberg admitted during a Joe Rogan interview in 2022 that basically their decision to limit that story's reach from the New York Post on the laptop was based on the FBI's warning. Twitter, you couldn't even share it via direct message, let alone share it on your account. So the censorship that they're doing is actively suppressing information that Americans need to determine not only how they're going to vote, but how they engage with their government.
And interestingly, the other side of the equation with regard to the FBI and the Department of Justice and their knowledge of the Hunter Biden laptops, plural, is that they had that information and had verified it, knew that it was accurate, real, and said and did nothing while Trump was impeached over Ukraine-related matters, that actually the Biden laptops would have provided some very interesting context on how to deal with Ukraine and what. So I mean, it actually. So they stood by and did nothing and watched a president get impeached when they knew that they had information off the laptop that certainly would have offered a counter narrative to what was going on.
Yeah.
And not a word out of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And even it's important to point out the CIA reportedly solicited signatures for that letter, that infamous letter that was issued of over 50 former intelligence officials claiming that the laptop had all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. And we now know that Antony Blinken, now Secretary of State, who then worked on the Biden campaign, was actively coordinating with officials within the CIA.
To advance that. You know what else is interesting is that a lot of these guys who are formers, former deputy director of this, former assistant, blah, 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 they all have these very important titles. What is not known or appreciated largely is that these guys then go out and take their clearances that they have from those positions and leverage it for jobs out in the private sector. Mm-hmm. And they have active clearances and they have active associations with these agencies and use that to make money. It's their meal ticket.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would encourage and I think this is a true statement, should President Trump be reelected, all these guys, all 51 and all the little munchkins around them, because there's an entire squad of cheerleaders who helped this happen, they all should have their clearances revoked, cut off the meal ticket.
Yep.
Shut down the money so that these guys who go around, and really they leverage the government service for their own enrichment afterwards.
Yes.
They suddenly are now, they're suddenly now on the boards of Fortune 500 companies, and everyone goes, oh, we have an expert. We have this guy who used to be a CIA guy or an FBI guy, and they're plugged in. They know what's going on, and they rely on that corporately to make money and to then use it also. So. Shut it down, turn it off. You want to see everybody kind of snap to and suddenly straighten up their act and pay attention to what they're doing. Turn off the dollars and cents to these guys who've really, it's a racket, the money. And the same is true, frankly, for military officers. You have you have flag officers, generals, and admirals who do the very same thing. They leverage, somebody, a complete disgrace like Mark Milley,
right,
who should be sitting in jail at Fort Leavenworth for really treasonous conduct. And this guy's running around pretending he's the second coming.
Yeah.
Really a horrific character.
And it's people like John Brennan, James Clapper.
Exactly.
These are people who are running the highest intel agencies in our country, had the highest positions, and yet they were out there not only claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, but they continued to perpetuate the Russia collusion hoax for years and have suffered virtually no consequences for that, trying to undermine Donald Trump and his administration. You go back, it took them years, the first 3 years of his presidency. We didn't get Robert Mueller to testify until the summer of 2019.
Yeah.
So that dragged out his presidency for a year and really hampered his administration's ability to accomplish anything, at least in that division of the administration.
You're exactly correct. So what is your guesstimate? Not that you have a crystal ball, but what sort of things do you think are going, based upon your interviews and your reporting, your background study on all this, what are CISA, FBI, there's probably a couple of other folks who are, kind of sub rosa running around doing these sorts of things. What are they doing? What do you think that they're up to?
Yeah, obviously we have no idea, and that's the scary part is we don't know what these agencies are up to. I would imagine, if I had to guess, that anything having to do with Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, the Biden family foreign business dealings, we've gotten a lot of information that's come out through investigations, thanks to House Republicans. So I would imagine that squashing that type of stuff would be front and center to help him ahead of the 2024 election. And I would also say stuff having to do with election integrity. You kind of also had this in the lead up to the 2020 election, where Donald Trump and some Republicans were raising alarm bells, saying like, hey, there are significant security risks with things like mass unsupervised mail-in voting. And CISA even privately acknowledged that there are significant risks with mass mail-in voting, but basically was making recommendations to social media companies through these kind of proxy groups to censor posts raising alarm bells about the risks of mail-in voting that they themselves had raised. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that probably in the lead up to 2024, especially given what we saw with 2020 and the things we've learned since. So I would imagine that would be a big topic as well.
Yeah, so something I also think is interesting, because I got some additional information on this. I was in Texas recently, and so the left used to brag that they were going to essentially replace a lot of voters in the United States through mass immigration. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of the Cloward-Piven strategy of demographic shifting.
Right.
And they used to brag about that. Then when people like Tucker Carlson in particular pointed it out, talked about it as the great replacement theory, then they became hysterical because he actually pointed at what they had bragged about in the New York Times, and they attacked him and said, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, blah, 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 right? Another disinformation campaign. Now I learn in Texas, there's this enormous push to give illegal aliens or persons who have unlawfully entered the country.
Undocumented immigrants.
Exactly. To give them Social Security cards or Social Security numbers. Mm-hmm. And in Texas, at the end of March, Texas alone suddenly had like 250 some odd thousand Social Security numbers issued just in Texas. Mm-hmm. You might say, well, so what? That lets them pay Social Security tax when they get a job. That's not the point. They're being given Social Security cards in order to be enrolled or to become registered voters. Mm-hmm. So they're using the Social Security card as the leverage document for voter registration, because it legitimizes their presence here, right? If you have a Social Security, you must be part of the system. You must be legit. And that's tied, of course, with voter, which is another scandal, right? So you have states like Arizona that say, well, we bounced the voter rolls against DMV, which it's not a legitimate double check. And what happens is both the election integrity people, the election the secretaries of election at the county level and the DMV both point at each other and say, well, their numbers are what our numbers are. Of course they are, right?
Right.
So it's not a legitimate double check, and that's the problem that they're looking at in Texas, is that there's a very deliberate effort. And again, this is all knocked down as being disinformation,
right?
It has to be suppressed. But they're saying that this incredible increase in SSNs in Texas is another effort at skewing demographics and skewing voting rolls. So I'm sure that there'll be hysterical claims that this is all disinformation, misinformation, but the cards are out there, and they're seeing an increase in voting registrations, so figure it out, right?
Yeah, and the thing about that is that even if you don't give these people the right to vote, which is actually happening in some localities and states where they allow it, like California, Maryland, they are counted in the census.
Right.
So they skew representation for congressional seats, and that impacts, party representation in Congress. So even though the media is out there claiming, that this isn't a big problem, it actually is a big problem because you're actively changing not just the demographics and the culture of that state, but you're actively changing the congressional representation and the power certain states have in Congress.
Because you're skewing the body count.
Yes.
Because the body count doesn't differentiate between citizen
and non-citizen, exactly.
Lawfully present and unlawfully present. They don't discern the differences. They just do a straight head count. So Warner comes out, of course, and really kind of kicked the door open on this, right? Because he makes the mistake of saying the truth about what was happening. What has his office done as sort of follow-up to this? Has he just played ostrich and put his head in the sand, or how is he reacting to this information?
That's basically been the reaction I got. I didn't reach out to his office, but I mean, he really hasn't really talked about it much, and I think he kind of regrets saying it now because a lot of media outlets are picking up on what he said, and now you have the FBI on the record admitting that that's exactly what's happening. He did indicate in his comments that these so-called communications have resumed between big tech and the federal government around the time that the Murthy v. Missouri case was brought before the Supreme Courts for oral arguments back in March. So we know that at least since March that's probably what's been going on.
Yeah, they're very quick to jump in, and the government does not ever not exercise its authority.
Right.
So when they have permission to do something, they do something. I can't remember the guy's name, but there's an FBI agent who was assigned essentially to be the Silicon Valley focal point guy, and I can't remember his name, but there was one guy in particular. Was there any sort of accountability for his actions and all the contacts with Silicon Valley big tech firms? Because he was running around basically giving them their to-do lists for who to knock off of the internet.
No one's been held accountable for any of it. That's the scary part, is you have this vast web of what we call the censorship industrial complex, all of these various figures and actors. Nobody's been held accountable for it. Hopefully the Supreme Court will rule in our favor shutting this stuff down. I did not get the opportunity to listen to oral arguments, but from what I heard and people reporting, like Margot Cleveland, our senior legal correspondent, it did not go so well for the plaintiffs in the case. But I'm hopeful that ultimately we'll get enough justices to shut this stuff down. Yeah,
it's because it's one of those things where people don't appreciate what they're not seeing because they don't know that it's there, right? So you don't know what you don't know kind of thing, and that's the problem with this. Well, Shawn, listen, we hope that you continue to report on this and keep us up to speed. There's probably a lot of interesting angles to pursue on this, and I encourage you to go after it wholeheartedly. This is exactly the kind of reporting that people need to know about, because the government does all sorts of sneaky things unless someone's watching, and we're glad that you're watching.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on Watch. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks so much, boss.
I'm Chris Farrell on Watch.